Welcome back. This is Warburg Mistress, and I am very grateful that many of you have stuck around to see part 3 on the Curtiss-Wright CW-21 Interceptor, and episode 3 of what I had thought was going to be a trilogy, but we're looking at 4 videos here now. And the next 2 episodes will cover perhaps its most famous use and its only operational history in combat, save once in China, and that is a campaign in the Dutch East Indies. So welcome to the Curtiss CW-21, the mile-a-minute interceptor. If you did not see those 2 episodes, then you're missing out on the war in China, the development of the CW-21, its combat debut, and the disaster that led to them not making it into the AVG. So if you want to go watch those 2 first, do be my guest, and we'll welcome you back here after that. This episode can stand on its own as well. So if you want to watch this as it is, enjoy and welcome. Now, unlike the CW-21 in general, which has its story beginning in China, the story of the Dutch CW-21B really begins in Europe. As any trust in the Germans upholding their promises failed, the Dutch went looking for aircraft that were available immediately and could enter service upon arrival. The Germans were not to be trusted, and the Luftwaffe was to be feared. An interceptor was needed that could defend Dutch cities from German bombers flying at medium altitude. Dutch fighters could take on escorts as best they could, but something was needed to get to altitude quickly and return to base to strike again as soon as possible, all within the tight confines of the Netherlands. The Dutch had already seen the CW-21 demonstrated, and they had an interest in her that only waxed as they watched the fall of Poland and the tense Sitzkrieg on the Western Front. Both the Luftvaartbrigade, which is the aviation brigade of the Dutch Army, as well as the ML-KNIL, Militaire Luchtvaart van het Koninklijk Nederlands-Indisch Leger, were interested in the aircraft. Now, whilst the East Indies were largely autonomous in terms of government, economy, and even defense, both the KNIL and the Luftvaartbrigade agreed that the aircraft were needed, they were needed immediately, and that they were especially needed in Europe, but also available to the East Indies. Thus, the Luftvaartbrigade sent the order with arrangements to have the East Indies receive other fighters on order. For note, the ML-KNIL, known as the Luftvaartafdeling KNIL, up until 30th of March 1939, operated independently of the Continental Luftvaartbrigade, and was a part of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, not a part of the Continental Forces. Had its own organizational structure, was an organic part of the KNIL, and basically operated on its own priorities, with a budget overseen in the Netherlands, but otherwise, as I've said, independent. And that is important to remember as we go forward. As with the war in China, to appreciate CW-21B's place in the Dutch East Indies, an examination of the situation is appropriate. And so, just as I did with China, this video will largely focus on the background that led to the CW-21's adoption, and outline the position in which the Dutch East Indies found themselves by 1941. Now, since the late 30s, the Dutch knew that no matter what would happen in the Pacific, they were in Japan's direct line of sight. It became even clearer in 1940 and 1941. Japan needed the crude oil and the refineries that the Dutch had in the East Indies and the British had in Sarawak and North Borneo, and the Dutch needed to put up a defense, regardless of any American involvement in the Philippines or British involvement in the Malay Peninsula or their possessions on Borneo. Whilst the aircraft was initially conceived as a local defense interceptor for urban industrial areas likely to be subjected to terror bombing, such as the Netherlands homeland, the Dutch East Indies certainly needed something like this to protect their oil asset, and it was rather the case that the Dutch predominantly saw the CW-21B as a machine that was perfect for a light colonial fighter, very different from the role for which she had been designed. Now, colonial fighters were a class unto themselves, and something almost entirely unique to Dutch thinking. The closest that you could think of would be in the post-war era of the F-5 being used as affordable fighters for developing allied nations. But at this point, to design a fighter specific for one's overseas territories was something really only the Dutch did. The British and French relegated older models to units posted abroad, just as the United States had done with Panama and the Philippines, and the Dutch instead looked specifically for fighter designs that could be maintained and kept effective in the tropical conditions of the far-flung Indies without costing as much as fighters meant to engage other modern Western nations. After all, the Dutch had little to be concerned about in the Caribbean and South America, but air assets were an integral part of defense in the East Indies against enemies both foreign and domestic, and these aircraft had to function with what was likely the longest supply chain in modern warfare. Even in the Pacific War, the Allies had Australia and Hawaii as stepping stones and staging areas. The Dutch had nothing but foreign ports in the 16,685 kilometers, 10,367 miles, that spanned the distance between the docks of Rotterdam and those of Batavia. As early as 1923, the need for a combined recon and pursuit aircraft was seen. It was not as if any of the local tribal groups had aircraft, so it was clear that the Dutch were looking ahead to a future when a modern power could challenge them. And thus the Fokker DC-1 was designed for that setting, and 10 were quickly on their way to Batavia, with none serving in Europe. The clumsy, awkward, and unsuccessful NVI, the National Aircraft Industry, FK-31 was less of a success and ended up not going to the East Indies. The 17 examples made served with Finland, where she was clumsy, awkward, and unsuccessful at everything but looking like she belonged in a Popeye cartoon. The East Indies may have been a distant colonial possession, but the CNIL was discerning and not about to take something in that did not meet their needs. The 1933 Fokker C-10 was another example specifically for the East Indies. She was designed only after Fokker carried out extensive research in the field with the CNIL. The C-10 replaced the C-5, which had served in continental and colonial services. Built of mixed construction, like most aircraft at the time, she was designed to be a scout fighter and light bomber. 20 would serve in the Netherlands, and 13 in the East Indies, and another 39 made their way to the Finnish Ilmavoima. She was rugged, easily maintained, could take damage in rough handling, excelled at nap of the earth flying, and was both heavily resistant to rot and other threats in the tropical jungles, as much as she was able to function and even excel in the harsh Finnish winters. Imported fighters were also used in the role of colonial fighters, and here we see Curtiss begin a relationship with the CNIL. In September 1930, the Netherlands East Indies purchased 8 improved P-6D Hawks with water-cooled Conqueror engines and landing gear specifically made to handle the tropical environment. Described as Hawk 1s in the Curtiss inventory, 6 more were built for the East Indies by the Aviolanda Company in Papendrecht, South Holland. These would still be in service by the outbreak of the war in 1941. Just because the Dutch purchased and designed fighters for tropical service does not mean all of them ended up there, nor were purchases always unique for the East Indies, and shared procurement was not uncommon. For example, the 1931 Fokker D-17, a descendant of the famous Fokker D-7 of the Great War, had originally been designed as a colonial fighter, and the specifications were built around that. But she never left the continent and served only in the Low Country. In 1938, France's attempt at a dedicated colonial fighter was even produced by the Dutch, and it too would never leave the continent. The Koolhoven FK-58 would end up only serving in tiny numbers with the Free Polish forces during the fall of France. One of the most famous Dutch fighters of the mid-30s was also designed specifically for the East Indies, and she too would never make it there. This is the Fokker D-21 of 1936, and she would, like the D-17, only end up serving in Europe. Unfortunately, there are very few film clips, and what exists is mostly of Ilmavoima examples, and these do reflect the fame rightfully earned by the D-21 Finnish service. Designed under ML-KNIL specifications and meant specifically for service in the Indies, they had requested simplified construction, an emphasis on low cost, ruggedness, easy maintenance, and durability in wet jungle weather. As she was also considered for the export market, her adoption for continental service was thanks to the Dutch finally addressing the nearly abandoned luchtvaartafdeling a realization that the policy of polite neutrality may not always be the most effective means of defending one's nation, and Germany was an obvious threat close to home that was much more important at the time. The Fokker D-21 would in fact be the last colonial fighter of Dutch design and manufacture. Unfortunately, the reallocation of the Fokker D-21 would leave the Dutch East Indies without effective fighter cover. That being said, the Dutch Ministry of War, the Foreign Office, and Colonial offices had all agreed in the mid-30s on a position that the best defense was a good offense, and it was not seen as important to have a modern fighter on hand. In fact, the Curtiss P-6 Hawks and Fokker biplanes were all in storage through the second half of the 30s, while a force focused on bombers and long-range naval reconnaissance took hold. The backbone of air power in the Dutch East Indies were the then brand-new Martin 139s, export variants of the American B-10 bomber, and these had been ordered in enough numbers to staff 6 squadrons by the outbreak of the war, albeit undersized squadrons, and this reflects in a total of 58 examples plus 20 in reserve being on hand. In the mid to late 30s, the Dutch learned much from Spain and China, especially that time and distance were the biggest concerns when facing enemy bombers. Whilst the lack of early warning time left the Chinese begging for an interceptor, the Dutch felt they had a cushion to rely on, as distance gave them ample warning of any aerial threat in the Indies. Their air strategy was paired with a naval strategy of small, secret bases from which the Dutch Navy could strike in coordinated attacks, with the bomber forces also spread out into other small, secret bases. In addition to the main bases on Java, secret bases were built on Borneo, Sumatra, Celebes, and Timor, as well as many other islands, and even on the northern border of Sarawak and Brunei, in what was technically a British area. Now, I've looked through the diplomatic communications here, and I really can't find anything to see how that was pulled off, except for the land might have been leased, maybe off the books, with the Sarawak government, or procured through other means that were not as obvious to either the Colonial Office, or at least not documented as such. Built between 1936 and 1940, these were small, inconspicuous airstrips with manual fuel pumps, manual jacks for lifting ordnance, and nothing but the most basic of equipment and spare parts. The Dutch trained local European, Chinese, and native populations in land and air service reserve units to swing into action and operate from these bases as part of a coordinated, decentralized defense plan. Several outlying seaplane bases were also established, where flying boats could operate surreptitiously long after bombers would have targeted the main base at Surabaya. Now, whilst the Japanese did come to know about several of these bases before the outbreak of war, some were not discovered until long after the Dutch surrender, and even more escaped detection completely. And this goes to show how effective the camouflage that they used was employed, and how decoy bases were used effectively to catch the majority of Japanese attention. By 1938, as the war in China got hotter and political strife in Europe increased, it was clear that a bomber-only force would not be enough, and the short-lived delusion was over. Thus, only a year and change after making the decision to switch to a bomber-only force, the Dutch declared that they needed a colonial fighter that could be employed as a light pursuit aircraft in general, and as an interceptor against what aircraft might make it within range of Dutch assets. It had to be easy to maintain, light to ship, efficient, and ready to roll off the assembly line. As Japan advanced through China and preached of an Asia in the clutches of their own murderous manacles, as they strove to establish an Oriental empire beneath the bayonet of the rising sun, it was clear that the Japanese would stop at nothing to dislodge American, British, and other European powers, especially the Dutch. Of all of these, it was the Dutch in the East Indies who were perhaps most firmly a part of the local community and most attached to the land that had the resources Japan wanted and needed. Now, the European Dutch who had moved there had called the Dutch East Indies their home for centuries. They had cultivated a strong economy, and the East Indies boasted of an educated local elite class and a modern army with thousands upon thousands of European and native troops and officers, upon whom they could call for defense. The local population graded under Dutch rule in many areas, and Sumatra was not nearly as developed as Java. But the Dutch East Indies were largely considered the most successful colony, although not truly a colony but rather merely an overseas part of the Netherlands like any other. Unfortunately for the Dutch, they also held in their hands the keys to the resources Japan so desperately needed to finish their genocidal conquest of China: rubber, petroleum, plenty of deep-water harbors with modern port facilities, and, especially on Java, the modern railway and transport networks to exploit the resources. If the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere was to be co-prosperous, it would be so by draining the Dutch East Indies dry. The Dutch benefited from the fact that throughout the mid-30s there was no serious aerial threat with the range to reach Borneo or Sumatra. This would be so until the Nell and Sally made their debut, really. The true risk to the East Indies came from a naval force approaching from the South China Sea, especially if outfitted with carriers. Plans were put together for a class of pocket battleships specifically destined for Batavia, and the Dutch Navy's focus was completely on the Pacific, where the vital resources of oil, timber, minerals, rubber, and other raw materials kept the Dutch economy thriving and permitted Western nations to trade with the Dutch, rather than turning to sources which were less politically stable, free, or accessible. While this left little thought for the European, South American, and Caribbean Netherlands in terms of defense, the Dutch saw the resources of the East Indies as the most necessary thing to defend, and the most threatened part of their nation. In the Indies, choke points could be mined, torpedo boats and coastal defense ships deployed, and bombers kept on hand to collaborate with flying boats and submarines to take out any possible threat. And that remained true through the greater part of the 1930s. The Dutch could back this up with both manpower and material. They had learned a great deal during their neutrality in the Great War, and they had taken it to heart. By the 30s, the Dutch could boast some of the most advanced naval construction techniques and designs, especially in terms of fire control, remote-controlled mountings, and anti-aircraft capabilities, and they boasted technically superior submarines with advanced features like snorkel, as well as a fleet of destroyers which were among the best in the world. After all, the Germans had used puppet companies in the Netherlands to develop their U-boats in the Weimar years and in the first years of the Third Reich. But the Dutch had done them one better and saved the best for themselves. Protect their far-flung assets over the wide area that the Dutch East Indies covered. An elastic defense based on modern, mobile, quick-response task forces designed to intercept Japanese forces at a distance was what the Dutch had in mind and what they planned for throughout the 30s. Island garrisons, supported with the aid of Martin bombers and Dornier seaplanes, would be also supported by gunboats, coordinated coastal artillery emplacements, and a complex system of radio communications connecting both the main islands and the multitude of smaller ones with one another. Mine layers and submarines would be key to closing the net around any potential invader. In fact, when war would arrive, it was the Koninklijke Marine's subs that would take out more Japanese warships and shipping than the rest of the Allied forces combined in those first few months. This was a plan that was simple enough to execute on a colonial budget and in challenging settings over a large area, yet it was also a perfect example of defense in depth that made the most of modern combined arms operations theory, modern technology, and of a realistic threat assessment that fit into an equally realistic time frame in terms of what the Dutch could expect from the American, Australian, British Imperial, and French neighbors. The naval and army air assets were a linchpin in this plan at a time when many felt that a defensive plan in such a place was not feasible and where an offensive strike against them was equally incomprehensible. Towards the end of the 30s, with war in Europe looming as much as war in Asia, plans were thrown asunder by the Dutch naval assets being strategically placed in the Caribbean, Europe, and in the East Indies. From the original plan, the East Indies would end up being left with a mix of old and new that totaled 5 cruisers, some heavy, some standard, 8 destroyers of recent vintage, 24 submarines of mixed older and newer models, approximately 10 mine layers and 40 coastal mine layers and minesweepers of varying quality, 10 Woden-class gunboats from the 1870s, a few modern gunboats and patrol boats, and about a half-dozen torpedo boats. Most of these would be harbored at Surabaya, as they waited to be deployed to various ports, harbors, and hidden little spots in response to an approaching threat. By May 1940, the aircraft available were deployed at Bandung, Malang, Batavia, Madiun, and at Buitenzorg, all on Java. Bandung boasted 22 Martin bombers. Singosari at Malang had 16 of them. Batavia had 42 Martins. And at Madiun's Masbate field were the recently arrived dozen Curtiss-75 Hawks. Now, this may sound like a lot, but in 1940, eyes had opened to the fact that it was not nearly enough. With the fall of Poland and little more than faith sustained Dutch hopes of their neutrality being respected by Germany, the importance of aerial defense could not be overstated, and the Dutch knew it. Organizationally, they prepared the ML-KNIL by promoting the commander, Ludolf Hendrik van Ooyen, from major in 1934 to major general in 1940, and making the force fully independent of the army. Furthermore, a purchase commission to the United States was sent in April of 1940 for both the continental and overseas Dutch military. The Dutch knew they were in the same position the Chinese had been both in Europe and the East Indies. Specifically, interceptors were desperately needed to defend cities and military bases in Europe, as well as in the Dutch East Indies, where the shipping lanes, military bases, and oil production centers found themselves increasingly in the sights of a Japan desperate for these resources. Simply knowing the Japanese were likely to be on their way by sea was no longer enough. The Dutch now knew they would have to stop new medium bombers that could reach the Indies, and modern carrier-based aircraft which Japan had at her disposal, like the Aichi D-3A Bal and Nakajima B-5NK. And these interceptors needed to get into the air quicker than any German bomber could unload the opening blows of what likely be an undeclared war, and have the sturdiness, ease of operation, range, and power to strike at Japanese forces assaulting them on multiple fronts. Unfortunately, the almost destitute Netherlands armed forces would go shopping with too little, too late. The Fokker D-21 Colonial fighter had been turned down by the KNIL after an unfavorable test flight in February 1936. A refined design was then built and deployed in Europe, where the German threat was seen as clear and present danger. Deliveries commenced on 22 July 1938 and ended on 1 March 1939, with average deliveries of a paltry 4 per month. And fuel tank issues kept them largely grounded through the early summer of 1939. Dutch manufacturers were also handicapped by limited access to materiel and the poor interwar economy. Yet they were still working hard to build up modern Fokker G-1 destroyers, the plane that would become the primary fighter available come May 1940, and working on the Fokker D-23, of which only one was completed, but for which development resources were needed nevertheless. With the Army barely having time and money to train, and also needing manpower and resources for defensive constructions, machine guns, and anti-tank rifles, the steel industry and the skilled manpower pool available just were not able to meet every need. The only other suitable aircraft which could serve in any sort of fighter role on the continent was a 1933 vintage Fokker C-10 biplane scout and light bomber, and even then only 20 would be available come May 1940. These would serve alongside 28 of the even older Fokker C-5Ds of mid-20s vintage, as well as another 20 or so hacks and trainer. Now both the C-10 and the C-5D would have some success against the Germans by flying what they called house tree and beast level missions, or Hubobe, and doing their best against a very modern, experienced Air Force and Army. The situation showed that if any new fighters were to arrive, sending them to the East Indies was hardly on the agenda. Now, given the size of the Netherlands, no Dutch fighter could possibly get into the air quick enough to fight off German bombers. nor could American fighters on order do so. And unfortunately, war was closer than anyone could have imagined. Before the purchasing commissioners could even arrive back home, the Netherlands was under the German jackboot conquered. Unlike in Poland, the Luftwaffe faced little resistance as Fallschirmjäger dropped from the sky and infantry and panzers swept across the rivers, canals, marshes, and ancient cities of the nation that had weathered neutrality in the Great War in a state of near siege. In the blink of an eye, the Dutch fought for as long as they could hold out. Held back by the heroism of the Royal Dutch Army, it took the Germans 4 days to capture nearly all of the land east of Holland, which was the planned national redoubt. With the bombing of Rotterdam and Utrecht threatened with similar destruction, the Dutch surrendered forces east of Zeeland, where the troops fought on, lasting in Zeeuws-Vlaanderen for 3 more days. The royal family had fled, and the Germans had taken the European Netherlands, leaving only her overseas realms free. With the fall of Western Europe, not only had the Netherlands been reduced to her West Indian, South American, and East Asian lands, but France had also fallen, and the Vichy government had given access rights to Japan and Indochina, only for Japan to then violate those limited terms on the very day they entered in September, and then overtly stationing their military there, rather than claiming to use it only for airfields and transit purposes. None of this was much of a surprise to Dutch officials. With Japanese forces now well within striking range, fighters were needed as soon as possible. Now, we covered a bit of this in the last episode, as it was in this time that the CW-21s in Burma were stuck without a means of reaching China. So if you need to go back and see that, that should be in the end of video 2. Seeing the advantage in a fighter that could defend a Dutch homeland within scant minutes' reach of a German bomber, Dutch agents in the United States approached the major manufacturers to fill their need for an interceptor. The CW-21B was ordered on 17 April 1940, only 8 days after the fall of Denmark, together with C-22 Falcon trainers, a derivative model from the same origins. And you can see here the actual letter that I was able to obtain from the National Archives in the Netherlands, showing the agreement to purchase these aircraft from Curtiss-Wright. This project did demand a lot of me in terms of requesting documents and waiting for the National Archives and the Ministry of Defense to catch up with me, but I am grateful for all that they've been able to do. Even if so little of it ended up being used, I'd rather capture everything and present it to you guys so that we can all enjoy it together as part of our history. But back to the matter at hand. The purchase committee also entered into talks with Brewster, and talks with Brewster led to a letter of intent to purchase on 6 June 1940 for Brewster B-339s, a lighter, more maneuverable Buffalo variant, and a handful of B-439s with an upgraded engine. Now, Brewster's production lines were a total flustercluck, but we'll ignore that for now. Even this almost clandestine purchase was picked up in the press. The Chicago Daily Tribune's article of 21st April 1940, Interceptor Pursuit Ship for Air Raid Defense, by Wayne Thomas, read, "The airplane is being built to an order received from an unnamed foreign government." Bringing up the recent order of CW-22 trainers to Turkey, and the obvious relationship between them and the CW-21, perhaps he was hinting at Turkey being the customer. Regardless, the article, like those published a year before, shows that this is a fighter designed to defend urban areas from bombers. He fawns over the performance, although less due to facts and more due to corporate propaganda. The climb rate is remarkable, the construction and instrumentation simple, but otherwise she's seen as not any better than the Republic EP-1, the P-36, the Hurricane, the Spitfire, the Bf-109, or the Heinkel 112, or what the press claimed them to be. Now, the C-21B was hardly the most advanced fighter of the day, but the death of the general pursuit aircraft was the very point of Thomas's article. The CW-21 variant on which the Dutch settled was the proposed CW-21B. The B variant only existed on paper at the time, and no prototype would end up ever being manufactured. She would go from the drawing board direct to the East Indies. But first, she had to be shown off to the cameras. And here, for the first time in 84 years, is that demonstration. I'm ecstatic that it's here in time for this. Found nowhere else and requested specially from the National Archives in Maryland, this is the C-21B being shown off to the press and military representatives as shown in a Universal newsreel of 25 November 1940. I admit the quality's not good, but I'm working on that and costs quite a bit to restore, but I'm finding ways. The audio, unfortunately, does appear to be lost. According to Universal's records, the captions are, New Interceptor plane shown, St. Louis, Missouri. The new Curtiss-Wright Interceptor fighter, said to be the fastest climbing plane in the world, is demonstrated during groundbreaking ceremonies for a huge new airplane factory, the largest in the Middle West. So there we have it. It's not much, but I do hope you enjoy that as much as I did. I found it to be just an incredible find, and I'm beyond grateful that it was preserved after all these decades, and hopefully I'll be able to show a better version of that one day. The CW-21B was definitely an improvement on the CW-21 that China had ordered, and these were largely based on the suggestions that the Dutch had made when they first saw the CW-21 demonstrated. The streamlined B variant incorporated improved landing gear, increased armament of twin 30 caliber guns with 1,000 rounds per gun and twin 50 calibers with 400 rounds per gun, a two-way radio, a two-stage supercharger, non-icing carburetor, internal battery and starter switch, 3-speed variable pitch propeller, quarter-inch of improved steel armor plate behind the pilot, and quick detaching fittings for easy installation and removal of the engine. Now, concerning the radio, if it were an American service aircraft, it would likely have had an SCR-274N set, as was in the P-40. Curtiss marketing handbooks were not specific, however. For example, the handbook for the P-36 just says that radios can be installed for a moderate price. As these were kitted out for foreign service, a model from the Nederlandse Seintoestellenfabriek, the Dutch telegraph factory, now Philips, would have likely been installed. Dutch aircraft were usually fitted out with NSF's VR-27 3-channel radio transmitter receiver. The VR is for vliegtuigradio, or aircraft radio. The same kit was used by the Polish Air Force in 1938, and it was adopted into Luftwaffe service under the Philips name. Regardless of the American illustrations like this cross-section, where the radio seems to match an American one rather than Dutch models. Here we can see photos from the Luftwaffe manual, which is likely a more accurate depiction of what the C-21B would have had. Unfortunately, no further information on the radio kitted into the CW-21 could be found, and the Luftwaffe manual gives no information on performance or application. Now, all of these improvements made the B model 250 pounds heavier than the CW-21, and it reduced climb rate from 4,800 feet a minute to about 4,500 feet per minute, as recorded in Jane's 1940's All the World's Aircraft. But this was still quite an advanced fighter for such a small packet, and it was one that was able to reach 300 miles an hour, and it could peak at around 333, likely without a radio in place, as the top speed for the B was only 314 miles an hour, according to Jane's 1941 edition. She had a cruising range of 630 miles and a cruising speed of 282 miles an hour, which was still 40 miles an hour greater than the previous model. The 4,500-pound loaded weight also included 4 machine guns rather than the original 2. This could be a pair of 50s and a pair of 30s, although a pair of 30s was still listed as standard. Another 4 machine guns mounted on the wings, 2 of each caliber, was also optional, although this appears never to have been fitted and would have severely hampered performance and wing loading. It was clear to everyone, except the Japanese, that the next war was not one that was going to be fought with a mere 2 rifle caliber guns per plane. Now, for comparison, at this point in time, the Japanese had equipped the Claude and the Zero with the Type 96 Ku Aviation Model 1 voice telegraph system. It was well made, well designed, but poorly executed when implemented. The Japanese were often untrained in radio usage, and it was seen as cumbersome and difficult to work. It didn't help that it was often installed as an absolute afterthought. This is according to the Japanese own records. And if you're curious, you could find them in the compiled report translated for and published by the Military History section of Headquarters Army Forces Far East, titled Operational History of Japanese Naval Communications. Even before the outbreak of the Pacific War, it was more often the case than not that all radio equipment on Japanese aircraft, with the exception of the flight leaders, were removed to save weight, improve performance, and reduce pilot workload. Navigation was generally the flight leader's responsibility, so the two-way radio and the radio direction finder were seen as superfluous to the rest of the flight. Primitive for 1941 and better fit for a decade or a war prior, for the Japanese, it was the flags, hand signals, and wig-wagging of a generation past that were the order of the day. Now, the Allies believed, and it was still largely the case, that the Claude was the frontline pursuit aircraft of the Japanese Navy at the time. So let's compare that to what the Dutch had just received. An interceptor that was radio-equipped, mission-specific, and about to be deployed as part of a comprehensive plan of reconnaissance and defense in depth. We'll get to that in a bit, but suffice it to say, the Dutch had a much clearer vision of how to face the Japanese than did the Chinese and AVG, or even the Americans for that matter, at that point. The Dutch were also ahead of nearly every other nation in terms of predicting enemy activities and adapting their resources to face an experienced enemy at the cutting edge of technology and innovation. Unlike orders for France, which were sent to the Commonwealth or kept in American stores after June 1940, orders for the Brewster Buffalo, Curtiss-75, and CW-21 were neither stopped nor redirected to other nations, with the practical exception of 24 Curtiss-75s for which no engines were available regardless. Instead, aircraft on order were quickly redirected to the free areas of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the first dozen Hawks reaching the 1st Squadron, 4th Aircraft Group at Ondir, soon being transferred to Modon on Java just as German bombs fell on Rotterdam. It was also at this time the Dutch were learning that they'd been left out of some important conversations. Specifically, these were the American-British conversations, or ABCs, of which there were 14 in 1940 and 1941, culminating in the ABC-1 document of March 1941. The focus was completely on Europe, with Singapore not even being mentioned, let alone any defense of the East Indies in general. Despite the intimate relationship that the Netherlands had with the British, what with their indomitable Queen living in England, and active Dutch armed forces in exile and in the organized resistance being supported by the British, the East Indies were overlooked completely. When the American Rainbow 5 war plan had been drafted, the Dutch found themselves faced with allies who had no real idea of what threats may come their way. When finally engaged in the combined American-British-Dutch, or ABD, conversations, which were held in Singapore between 21st April and 27th April 1941, they found themselves in a much more comprehensive meeting, although one still under the shadow of the well-established Germany First policy. Contrary to belief, this was established policy well before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, and it led to a large disparity between forces available in the Pacific and those in Europe, and what plans were being made for each situation should war erupt. The nations involved were the United States, the Netherlands, Australia, New Zealand, and Great Britain. The Philippine interest was covered by the United States, the Dutch in conference being from both government in exile and East Indies governments, and British representatives included those from the Dominions as well as Great Britain herself, and the interests of the many territories of British holdings in what Malaysia is today. The Dutch found that the British plan was to reinforce the Philippines with the Americans so they could be used as forward air bases and submarine bases while relying on the unconquerability of Singapore, which was to be held at all costs. The Americans and others, meanwhile, had no real plan of active defense. The assets available at the time to the Americans, British, and Dutch were described as follows. At present, the numbers of aircraft and land forces available are below what is considered to be the safe minimum required. But to some extent, the power to concentrate air forces quickly makes up for the lack of numbers. By reinforcement, they meant supplying squadrons from other areas. 4 bomber squadrons from Malaya, 3 bomber and 1 fighter squadron from the Dutch East Indies, and all the American assets in the Philippines, together with 2 bomber squadrons from Australia to defend Ambon and the divided Dutch and Portuguese island of Timor. Whilst this may sound strong on paper, nearly all but a handful of these aircraft were outdated, and they were all in unenviable positions to collaborate towards defense. 2 squadrons of Bristol Blenheims and 1 of Vickers Wildebeests in Singapore were backed up in India and Ceylon of 2 more squadrons of Blenheims, 2 more squadrons of Vickers Wildebeests, 1 of Vickers Welsleys, 2 of Hawker Audaxes, 1 of Vickers Valentias, 2 of Westland Wapitis, and 1 of the venerable de Havilland Tiger Moth trainers, together with a smaller number of Hawker Hearts and Fairy Seals. All of this was meant to defend nearly 1 million square miles, stretching from the Persian border to the frontiers of Burma and the Himalayas. The Philippines at that time offered 4 American squadrons, 1 of Boeing B-17s, 2 of Savage P-35s, 1 Curtiss P-36 squadron, and a Filipino squadron of Boeing P-26 pea shooters. Notably, all these aircraft had been tested by Curtiss and shown to be outperformed by the CW-21, the CW-21 in which America had no interest. The Dutch would be expected to toss into the melee their 3 squadrons of Martin bombers and a single squadron of Curtiss 75s. Thus, the Dutch were reduced to acting as reinforcements to protect what were seen as the only vulnerable areas, British Burma, the Philippines, and, should all else fail, then the straits and passages of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch had planned on a bomber-based defense, and now they faced losing even that in the event of war, and having no fighter cover whatever to protect themselves. The overall plan for hemisphere defense grossly underestimated the Japanese threat and counted on the mistaken notion that the Philippines, Singapore, Wake, Guam, and Midway were all indefatigable fortresses which could withstand any assault. The militaries of the great powers were believing their own propaganda, just as they had before September 1939. Perhaps it reminded the Dutch of what they'd been hearing about France's ability to stand up to Germany, but this situation in the Pacific was certainly a wake-up call. The conference was a complete bust and ended with no real deliverables. To add insult to injury, a quarter of the American Pacific Fleet was sent to the Atlantic soon after. Nobody had any plans to protect the resource-rich and strategically located Netherlands East Indies. There was no possibility of Dutch resources from Europe. There were no defense resources of any kind in the West Indies, and they could not depend on British help in Malaya or American help south of the Philippines. The East Indies had their tiny fleet, their reserves of troops, and little else. What they did have on their side were more air assets than the last year, and a plan of their own to at least hold off the Japanese threat that they alone amongst the Allies did not underestimate. As of March 1st, this now included the CW-21Bs that had arrived and were organized into service. Despite the B variant not having been anything more than something on the drawing board when ordered 10.5 months prior, the CW-21B entered into Dutch service much sooner than the Brewsters, as the Brewsters would not arrive until December 1941. This was both a testament to how simple the craft was to manufacture and of how adaptable Curtiss was to the new wartime environment. Whatever it might be, it was the first real boost to the desperate ML-KNIL. War was clearly on the horizon. On the 26th of July 1941, American oil to Japan was cut off, Japanese assets frozen in American banks, and the forces in the Far East Command, under General Douglas MacArthur, was created to manage a build-up in the Philippines. That same week, Vichy France and Japan came to an agreement for bases and resources, only for the Japanese to betray them when on 22nd September they invaded French Indochina, killing thousands of French and Indochinese officers, men, and civilians. War now seemed imminent. By the close of autumn, the British had reinforced their paper tiger of Singapore, and all the Dutch could do was drill, drill, and drill. And that concludes this episode of the Curtiss CW-21B. The next episode will also include footage not seen in 80 years, and I just hope that everyone is sticking around for that. For that one, it's honestly just a matter of putting it together and doing the recording. Most everything's all set. I have gone through thousands of pages of things for this. I'm grateful to the National Archives of the United States. The archives over in the Netherlands have been wonderful. It is definitely been a lot of work. I know it's been a long time since the last video. And at this time, I do want to thank everyone who helped me fill in the gaps in terms of combat records, operational reports, purchase committee paperwork. This is the culmination of nearly a year of research, and too many dead ends to count, unfortunately. So thanks do go to the Dutch government, who were so helpful in telling me that they had next to nothing, even when a friend of mine physically went to search the archives. The blog Java Gold was excellent in helping me prepare. Likewise, in addition to Bloody Shambles by Cole, Shores, and Izawa, there's a complete series of books just on the air war in the Dutch East Indies which I used. These were written by P.C. Boer. They are in Dutch, but if you can read any Germanic language, I recommend you to try and muddle through them, as they are wonderful. Even if you don't get everything, it's worth looking at. They are likely the most in-depth books on aviation in the Dutch East Indies, especially his volume De Luchtstrijd om Indië. So that's where we're going for the next episode, as well as where we're coming from for this one. And I'm sure that the best really is saved for last. I hope you're all here to enjoy that. Until next time, my name is Claire, and I am the Warbird Mistress. Take care.